Hey Pedro, how are you?
Good. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for reaching out. Um, so I mentioned in my email I had another meeting scheduled, so we only have an hour, but
That's
hopefully,
fine. I also have to teach soon.
yeah. Okay, good. Well, this will be a good start at least. And why don't you introduce yourself and say a little bit about your research on Bergson and energy? Because I know this article is just a condensed version of your dissertation. Is that right? Pretty
Yeah,
much?
it's a condensed version, especially of the third chapter, but it condenses all the main ideas, I think, of the dissertation.
Okay. Well, say a little bit about yourself and how you came to be so interested in this topic.
Yeah. My name is Pedro Brea. I'm a lecturer at the University of Colorado Boulder in the Herbst program for Engineering, Ethics, and Society in the Philosophy Department, and also a lecturer at the University of Colorado Denver in the Philosophy Department. And how I came to this, got my PhD in philosophy, but I majored in physics as an undergrad. Um, and towards the end of my undergrad, I enjoyed physics. I'd liked if I were a physicist 100 years ago, would have enjoyed the sort of pen and paper blackboard physicist, but I didn't really enjoy the day-to-day of coding and being a physicist. It wasn't for me. But I
Yeah.
also had a very huge bout of very deep depression and anxiety towards the last 2 years of my undergrad, and I came to realize that it had a lot to do with the mechanistic worldview, or what Whitehead would call the scientific materialism, that I really um,
Hmm.
that I what's the word that I'm looking for, that I really internalized when I looked at the world. I guess in my quest for an authentic intellectual outlook on things. And so I was very much a nihilist and not in a good place and didn't want to continue with physics. And I only started to heal once I started reading philosophy. And I had already been exposed to philosophy in Brazil. I did part of high school in Brazil, and I loved it. It was love at first sight. And I wanted to major in philosophy as an undergrad, but my parents didn't let me at the time. They completely support it now, but they said we're not going to essentially pay for our son to be homeless at the time. I'll never forget when they said that.
Yeah.
And so I chose physics because it's natural philosophy. So it was kind of my, way around that. And so I finally went back to it, and then especially reading the existentialists at the time started to give me a sense of meaning again. And then I found, I can't live without this. So I figured I'd pursue philosophy kind of in a way to heal myself. And so that's how I started. And eventually, I think to make a long story short, in my quest to overcome scientific materialism, um, I ended up writing this dissertation on energy. And man, there's, I guess, so many ways that I could approach this. But I think in my dissertation, what I'm trying to do is overcome the mechanistic worldview. And I do that by showing how science has, um, I guess, not taken the reality of time seriously. That basically one postulate of the mechanistic worldview, and that a lot of scientists still hold on to, is that change isn't something that's ontologically self-sufficient. Um, And I see that as kind of maybe a line of flight out of the mechanistic worldview. And that's when I ran into Bergson. Nietzsche was my first love in philosophy, but then I discovered Bergson, and um, that's how the dissertation came about. Um, I started with Nietzsche because Nietzsche made me realize that my commitment to truth, the will to truth, is what committed me to nihilism. Because I thought it was true, and I'd rather, commit to nihilism rather than commit to something that I thought was false. But I realized that that was a false dichotomy. But then Bergson gave me, I think, more of the metaphysical tools to engage with physics and kind of deconstruct it from the inside out. And I picked energy because I was dealing with Nietzsche's will to power, read some Bataille, which made me interested in energy. And it was just, I think, one concept that I found as an entry to, I guess, try to dismantle scientific materialism.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, this is personal for you. Like this shift into philosophy was really a way of dealing with some mental health issues. And I've heard that from so many people that go into physics that it can, I mean, grad school is, I guess this was an undergrad that you were struggling with depression, but
Yeah,
I think anyone that's gone through graduate school knows how difficult that can be, just no matter what the subject is.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, when did you read Bergson after Nietzsche? And so did Nietzsche initially uh, buoy you a little bit mentally and psychologically, or did you still feel somewhat depressed reading Nietzsche, or like what was that journey into philosophy at first like for you?
Yeah. The way that my friend from grad school, Kevin, put it is that reading Nietzsche makes you want to run up a mountain, and it did at
Yeah.
first. It really was empowering for me. Um, Eventually, I feel like I kind of hit a road, maybe a little bit of a roadblock, an impasse with Nietzsche when I wanted to engage a little more positively with physics. And Nietzsche, I think, definitely does, but not to the extent Bergson does. And really, I only read Bergson because I wanted to understand Deleuze better. Bergson was kind of an afterthought at first,
Hmm.
but then I read Matter and Memory, and it changed everything. Um, yeah, Matter and Memory is one of my most formative philosophical texts. I absolutely love it. I want to return to it and read it again and again because I thought it was the most elegant solution I'd seen to the mind-body problem. Um, and so, yeah, I was exploring Deleuze because that I my thought definitely goes in that direction, but kind of really stuck with Bergson. And I think my
Hmm.
attachment to Nietzsche was more that in Nietzsche I found a way to one authentically criticize um, scientific materialism in a way that was intellectually honest and also a way to incorporate values into my life, to take values seriously, which for me meant the distinction between life affirming and life denying values. And actually, now I've kind of made a return back to ethics. I kind of seem to fluctuate between ethics, metaphysics.
That's
And
good.
now um, I've actually been reading more like the literature on mysticism, Simone Weil, Iris Murdoch. Now my interest has shifted very much to taking seriously the good, the transcendence of the good, and I think any metaphysical inquiry for me now has to put that in first place. Is how do we incorporate a sort of transcendent idea of goodness or the one that you see in
Hmm.
Plato or Plotinus or people like Murdoch or mystics into your metaphysical worldview. And in one sense, that might be I guess, an acceptance on my part that I will never have all the answers or be a system builder like Whitehead, for example, who just goes so deep and creates such a complete system. But in another sense, I think I've come to accept that it's all for naught if we can't make room to take a, like this idea of the good seriously, because I have come to accept that that is the beginning and the end of philosophy. And so I'm trying to straddle these two worlds a little bit now,
Mhm.
thinking about the good and also its place in metaphysics.
Right. Is Bergson's, I think, was it his last book, Two Sources on Morality and Religion? Has that been influential for you or
I haven't read it. I plan on
yeah,
reading it this summer. I haven't read it yet, so I can't say anything
that's
about that.
exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing how that lands with you because I mean it speaks to all of those issues. And It's so relevant right now, I think, given the rise of, nationalism again and he speaks very powerfully to the dangers of certain forms of ideological capture
Yeah,
and what keeps human beings free and fresh in our thinking, and it really ties right into his earlier um, work in creative evolution and yeah his earlier books like Matter and Memory, and so it's a great application of his philosophy to these ethical questions. So um, I'm excited to see how you respond to that Bergson text, but I'm not as steeped in Bergson's earlier work as you are from the sound of it. But I've always been attracted to his perspective. I mean, Creative Evolution is such a beautiful text, and now that I've spent the last 15 years or so of my life really trying to understand Whitehead, um, it's clearer to me where there are some I don't know about irreconcilable differences, but there are definitely some. I mean, they're both like on the same team, I think,
yeah,
against materialism and false spatialization and mechanism and all these things. But there are some interesting differences that I hope we can get into. So you chose energy to focus on in your dissertation, and is it just that there's one chapter on Bergson, or is the whole dissertation mostly looking at a Bergsonian perspective on that question of energy?
So Bergson's just one chapter. The first chapter, I develop a genealogy of energy because it began with Nietzsche and inspired by a genealogical approach to understanding concepts.
Right.
And that's where I demonstrate that the thread that ties energy concepts is what Bergson would call the tendency to explain the mobile in terms of the immobile, basically a bias to um, not treating change as something ontologically self-sufficient. And so the first chapter is on the genealogy of energy from um, ancient Greece, early Christianity, how they use energeia. I thought the employment of Orthodox Christianity, of how they use energeia, was very interesting.
Mm.
All the way up to modern thermodynamics, up to the 19th century. Second chapter is on Nietzsche, um, where I tried to, for me, it was a riddle that drew me in. What does he mean that science is the basically the modern iteration of the ascetic ideal? I try to unpack that in that chapter. Then Bergson, then Deleuze, but the Bergson chapter is the longest.
Nice. Um, so let me, how much Whitehead have you read? Uh, or
I
how
have
familiar are you with Whitehead?
this past summer I tried I starting Process and Reality. I got just a little bit into it. Mostly time constraints didn't let me. I've read most of your book on Whitehead,
Mm.
on the World Soul. A lot of secondary sources on Whitehead. I'm teaching Whitehead in one of my classes now. A few chapters from Science in the Modern World in my History of Science class.
Mhm.
And so I think I have a kind of an idea of the general outline of things. And I'm still trying because it's a little hard to penetrate, but I'm very interested in, like, for example, the concept of prehension, eternal objects, the way he treats of the past. I think that's really the key. What I see of a revolution, perhaps a philosophical and scientific revolution, is taking the idea that the past is preserved seriously as one big revolutionary step that needs to be
Yeah.
taken.
Right.
Um,
Do
and
you have a
also,
sense?
I want to learn more about how Whitehead incorporates ethics, especially
Mm.
when he talks about beauty into his metaphysics. Those are the questions that I've been trying to, and his solution to the mind-body problem. The idea that mind is just the intrinsic temporality of an event, I find incredibly interesting.
Right. Do you feel like you've come to recognize any tensions between his approach and Bergson's yet, or does it still feel like you're noticing more of the consonants?
I notice a lot of consonants. I think maybe at least I'm not going to say I'm a specialist on Bergson. I've read Creative Evolution and Matter and Memory. It seems like maybe Whitehead goes a little deeper. And Bergson maybe takes time just as seriously, but um, I, s- I don't want to overstep my bounds. But my intuition is that Whitehead seems to go a lot deeper in his system building than Bergson does.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably true. I took some notes beforehand looking at both what Whitehead says in his published works about Bergson, but also over the last few years, a lot of his student uh, notes from his Harvard lectures have been published, and so he talks about Bergson quite a bit um, during his lectures, and especially 1924, 1925. He was clearly reading a lot of Bergson, and I guess the historical background there is, Whitehead worked with Bertrand Russell on the Principia Mathematica, and Russell really didn't like Bergson. Like, um, has nothing positive to say because um, you know Russell is such a um, he's an empiricist, but he's a very analytical mind, and he thinks Bergson just like is he would consider Bergson to be uh, not doing philosophy so much as writing literature, and was very dismissive, called Bergson anti-intellectual, and said the same thing about William James. And Whitehead's trying to he says in Process and Reality, maybe you read that part. I think it's towards the beginning that he's trying to um, save Bergson's mode of thought from the charge of anti-intellectualism. And so he wants to render what Bergson
Hmm.
is doing in terms that would be acceptable to someone like Russell, his friend. Um, but Whitehead says he makes this funny comment in his Harvard lectures. He says, Bergson is on the whole right about the spatialization of time and whatnot, but phrases it so that you can never be quite sure what he means. This is why Russell dislikes him so. Bergson has a merit greater than clearness, however. He has philosophical originality, putting things in a way that he feels and sees them, whether he can make them clear or not. So that's a student, trying to record what Whitehead is saying, but you can see how um, Whitehead deeply respects Bergson's intuitions, but he's in his system, yeah, he's trying to develop a coherent way of understanding science that wouldn't just leave science to its mechanistic devices. Whitehead thinks science can become organic and that it can avoid um, that intellect can avoid uh, falsely spatializing and can engage in abstraction in a way um, that would not lead us to mechanize everything, but that he thinks science can be reformed so as to take the creative advance of nature seriously, so as to take real time seriously. And that's why, his whole metaphysical scheme is an attempt to show how um, mm, that extension is not necessarily um, that nature.
Primary.
Well, Whitehead says there are two types of extension. There's temporal extension and spatial extension. And so
Hmm.
he doesn't disagree with Bergson that time is real time or duration is this what Bergson will call a qualitative multiplicity, like no two moments are ever the same. And there's no way to sharply divide one moment from the next. Um, but Whitehead also thinks that a concrete occasion of experience, which for him is like, that's what nature is composed of, these actual occasions of experience, that they're both temporal and spatial, that there's some spatial extension to what is most concrete in nature, but it's not a spatial extension that would be metrical, that would be measurable by some geometry. It's a kind of, Whitehead doesn't want to separate space and time, and I think is critical of Bergson's what sometimes feels like a dualism, um, matter and memory, duration and extension. Like Bergson has this way of thinking very, I think, productively, uh, but still dualistically, making important distinctions. And Whitehead's trying to bring space and time back together, um, and correct for some of the, I think, mistakes that Bergson makes when he attempts to um, enter into dialogue with Einstein when, Bergson published his book Duration and
Yeah.
Simultaneity and talked about the twin paradox. It seemed like he was making an important point to distinguish duration from um, Einstein's understanding of a spatialized time, but there were some claims he makes that are just, it seems like empirically wrong when
Yeah.
the experiments were done that showed this relativistic effect. And so that led, Bergson's whole project and engaging with science to be dismissed. Like he was the most popular philosopher in the world, and then that confrontation with Einstein, in the aftermath of that, it made it people more and more thought, oh, philosophy is now taking a back seat and science is in the lead because the philosophers don't understand the physicists anymore. I don't think that's a fair assessment, but because Bergson did make some mistakes in that book, um, that was the perception. And Whitehead's trying to salvage his critique and I think articulate an understanding of the becoming of nature in a way that's still consistent with relativity theory, which, ultimately Bergson was too. But I think um, Whitehead is moving a little bit more in the direction of acknowledging, say, multiple time systems in nature. And, Bergson has this sense of overlapping um, rhythms, of time. And it's not, he wasn't, but sometimes Bergson seems to argue for a one cosmic time, one cosmic duration. And I think Whitehead's a bit more circumspect about that. given the limitations of relativity theory. But
Do you know the philosopher of science Milich Čapek?
yes, yeah.
So I've been teaching, I teach his book in my history of science class, and he talks about that cosmic duration. I'm just pointing this out because he points out that Bergson was wrong, and that I think Bergson denied that with the twin paradox that there was an actual difference in aging between the twins.
Mhm.
Um, Says that Bergson got that wrong, but and again, I'm not a specialist on Whitehead, but Chapek seems to be grounded, especially in Bergson and Whitehead. I think maybe Whitehead even more. And let me move somewhere else because my connection is unstable. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Um, let's see this
Like
desk.
actually, while you're doing that,
Yeah.
a package was delivered that I need to get at my front door. So give me just 1 minute and
Yeah,
I'll,
perfect.
yeah. Sorry about that.
No, it's all good. I was just wanting to point out that I don't know if this squares with what Whitehead actually said, but Chapek claims that although Bergson was wrong, that Bergson said, "Oh, it's just in the math. It's only in the math that the twins age differently. In real life, they wouldn't, which is the empirically wrong part." He does argue that Bergson was right, that there is one universal cosmic duration, and that he seems to say Whitehead would say the same, but the difference is that if you think for like there is time dilation, and so there is a relativity in terms of how you metrically measure that time. There will be a concrete difference there empirically, but the fact that these world lines still can converge within the same duration is the way he interprets Bergson saying that there is a universal cosmic duration. So yes, if you compare them, if you measure them and compare them metrically, there will be a relativity in the time, but they still exist within the same cosmic temporal flux, essentially. And he, that's what he says about Bergson. And I'm trying to remember, I think he implies maybe that Whitehead says something similar, but I defer to you on all matters Whitehead.
Hmm. I mean, I think the closest Whitehead would come to affirming a kind of cosmic duration would be in his theology, where the divine actual entity is kind of like this macrocosmic um, instance of concrescence.
Yeah,
So, in some sense, everything going on in the universe is happening in God's duration, you could say.
yeah,
And so, in that sense, there's a shared sense of immediacy in a kind of eternal present. And so, it's not physics anymore. We're talking now in more mystical terms. And I think, maybe there is some convergence there um, with Bergson, who doesn't talk too much about God. I mean, he has a theology, comes out particularly in that last book I mentioned,
yeah,
Two Sources of Morality and Religion. But yeah, there's a level in which I think they do reconverge. I think the real so one of the tensions between them is this question of whether duration is continuous or discontinuous. Whitehead has this sense of as I mentioned, uh, time. He has an what's called an epical theory of time, that time is actually a series of like pulses, you could say, and actual occasions are um, um, inheriting from one another, and they're not, he doesn't want to conceive each actual occasion as an instant. It's not a slice, but it's very easy at first glance when you read Whitehead to think that, oh, this is the cinematographical error Whitehead's committing here by
yeah,
breaking up time into these discrete instants. But he's not considering, he doesn't want us to think of actual occasions as instantaneous, but he also says they're not in physical time, which is to say they're not in clock time. And so there's they're examples of duration. It's like Whitehead wants to say that that duration comes in these quantum leaps, if you want, or comes in quanta.
yeah.
Um, and I don't know whether you think that's potentially compatible with what Bergson is saying. It's just a more systematic way of rendering this idea of a continuous of a qualitative multiplicity. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
And so Bergson does try to really emphasize the continuity of duration, but also he talks about, like, for example, the nervous system is for him not a doesn't store memories, but is a mechanism of selection for memories. And so in that sense, I think maybe you introduce discontinuities in the sense that I guess for Bergson, our past is always imminently sort of present to us even without our awareness. But what the nervous system does is select different memories that are useful for the current situation. And so that might introduce some discontinuity, right? Because I might be here focusing on you. If I see, I don't know, if I smell the smell of a jasmine, I'm going to think about my childhood playground, right? And so in that sense, maybe there's some discontinuity there. But I think you're right in that. In Whitehead, I think again, there's a more systematic treatment of this because Bergson really, I think, wants to emphasize the continuity of how, because even though it is discontinuous, maybe there's a discontinuity in the memories that are being selected, for example. It all, I think he'd say, it flows seamlessly together. Um, and so I think it would require some more thinking about, well, what is that discontinuity what does it consist of? Because I guess my question for you is, Bergson would say, everything flows seamlessly into each other. And so where is the discontinuity introduced for Whitehead, in terms of moments in time? Because we experience it as one seamless flow, right? But again, that doesn't, it's like in quantum mechanics, right? Particle energy exists in quanta, but we experience it as continuity. Um, and so is
Mhm.
it similar for Whitehead that you have a sort of quanta of events that create one continuous event? Is that how
Yeah.
he's looking at it?
Yeah, he has this phrase where he says there is a becoming of continuity, but not a continuity of becoming.
Huh.
Which is to say, obviously our experience is continuous, but he thinks that that's composed of these actual occasions, which uh, I think he's partially this is a result of him being a deep reader of William James and James having in his phenomenology an account of what he calls drops of experience. I mean, James is very similar to Bergson too, and read Bergson very closely, and um, I think they were buddies actually. But James wants to be able to, and Whitehead wants to be able to have some sense of individual decision, right? And so part of what these actual occasions um, are these they're processes of um, inheriting the past, but selecting from that past relevant data for a kind of aesthetic achievement and a kind of satisfaction, is Whitehead's term, that brings some new value into the universe that wasn't already in the past. And so um, Whitehead also wants to be able to address Zeno's paradox, which I know Bergson did as well. But
Yeah.
Bergson's approach to solving that paradox is to say the intellect just doesn't get it. The intellect just can't understand real motion and real time. And so it's a sort of dilemma that the calculating mathematical intellect gets itself in, trying to understand motion as if it were just a series of instants.
Yeah.
And where Whitehead wants to go with that paradox instead is to say, well, um, time is not a series of instants. Uh, it's it's a series of becomings, and that we can still do mathematical analysis of motion as long as we're aware of the difference between our the abstractions in our calculations and the actual becoming of nature. But he thinks the actual becoming of nature is a series of pulses where each pulse is like inheriting the entirety of the past, but then
Mhm.
adding something new to that. And it's like Whitehead doesn't want to make discreteness into just an artifact of the intellect trying to engage practically in the world. He thinks that nature itself has this discrete element to it, and you know quantum physics is a big reason for that, but also like I mentioned, James's psychology. Um, he's worried that this, if there's just a continuity of becoming at the psychological level, there's no room for like free decisions to come in and like do something new.
I
Um,
see.
which I know, Bergson has his own way of explaining that. So there's that psychological reason wanting to preserve individual decision, but also coming out of quantum physics, it seems that there are these, discrete leaps um, that aren't continuous. The wave function seems to be continuous, but again, uh, measurement makes it seem, and decoherence makes it seem like nature has these. Um, nature does take leaps, contrary to what the ancients might have said about uh, nature not taking leaps. So both from quantum physics and from human psychology, I think Whitehead's trying to preserve some sense of um, he uses the term atomicity. He doesn't mean Newtonian atoms, but some sense of there being that becoming comes in these pulses, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, and yeah, no, you everything you said said it so well. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure I have anything to add to that. I think that absolutely yeah, Whitehead, it's interesting to hear about the focus on atomicity, that Bergson tends to maybe one-sidedly focus on becoming, whereas Whitehead seems to try to preserve some aspect of being and becoming as things that can't be separated. Um,
Right.
in reality. And I think for Bergson, the way he talked about freedom is that freedom for Bergson is the arithmetical difference between virtual action and real action. And so our nervous system allows us to deliberate on having many possibilities of action, whereas for a simple organism, there might be only one possible response. But in a similar sense, like as you said, it requires the selection of memory. And so our nervous system allows for a more complex, I guess, select process of selection of relevant memories for how to respond to a situation. And in that sense, that might be the atomicity of Bergson, but he does, in his rhetoric, to my understanding, want to focus a lot more on the continuity of becoming. But it's interesting, I think, to think of the atomicity of time, like think of time as quanta. It reminds me of what Chapik says that with he thinks that White Bergson, but especially Whitehead, points science in the direction of memic causation. How do we think about the past as the scaffolding in which you have, I think the word you use is right, pulses of becoming. Um, that these pulses inherit the whole of their past but do something new with it, that I think is one of the more interesting things in um, science and philosophy. And I think I'm starting to see people take this more seriously, that but how it inherits the past, I get that's where you may lose some people. It automatically requires some sort of theological conception to make sense of that, which is unfortunate, because just because it is theological doesn't necessarily mean it's unscientific. I think it's a more just view of becoming than just trying to uh, obstinately stick with a form of materialism.
Right. Yeah. And I think, in Science in the Modern World, when Whitehead looks at the history of science going in Europe, going back to the 17th century, he says that, there are very clear theological um, presuppositions that all the early modern scientists had that led them to believe that the universe was intelligible and that, through mathematics, human beings could decode, natural processes, and that unless there was this scholastic theological background, these early modern scientists never would have made that assumption.
Yeah,
And there's a certain kind of theology that led to mechanistic science, which was this sort of deistic view, that God's fully outside the universe, designed it according to rational laws, and set it in motion. And if Newton wasn't working with that sort of theological imaginative background, his mathematical physics, and similarly for Descartes, like their approach to physics would have been totally different. And so I think with thinkers like Bergson and Whitehead, engaging in metaphysics and theology and changing that conception of the divine to be less um, deistic and more pantheist or panentheist, that comes with a new kind of physics too. That transforms science. And so if you refuse to recognize these connections between theology, whether it's an implicit or explicit, connection, you don't need to be, you know, uh, explicitly as a physicist, explicitly engaging in theology to motivate your physics, but unconsciously you're being influenced by certain theological images
Yeah.
just by virtue of how you understand like what is it to be a knowing scientist in relationship to the natural world. Like there's all sorts of a theological structure to that very question that can't be avoided. And so I think, yeah, Bergson and Whitehead, by changing that theological and metaphysical substructure, allow us to articulate a very different kind of physics, and a very different understanding of knowledge too, so that it's more participatory. We recognize that like nature wasn't just created once through some act of divine fiat to have fixed laws and so on, but is more of an evolutionary process, and laws might be more like habits in that case.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious to hear if you think that these Bergsonian and Whiteheadian are just generally process oriented views um, are seeping into the sciences, physics and biology more. Do you see that there's a shift happening, or is it still there's a lot of inertia, you think?
I lately I haven't been following developments as much.
Mm.
Though there was one theory that I kind of got into for a while. It's been questioned, the legitimacy of this theory in chemistry called assembly theory.
Oh yeah,
Um,
Lee
Meaning,
Cronin, right?
yeah, Lee Cronin. And I hesitate to bring it up because a lot of people in the scientific community are skeptical about it. But I think if anything,
Mm.
even if it's not necessarily a correct theory or independent of whether people actually take it up or not, I think it's interesting that it tries to make the move at the very least to say, there is some sort of memory in the universe, that natural selection depends on on a sort of, I don't want to say cosmic memory, but essentially that's what it is. In the sense that the way that natural selection works is, if something happens once, it's more likely to happen again. There are paths that have already been treaded by nature, and that information is always somehow imminent to evolutionary processes, which is really reminiscent to me of the Elan Vital, that these evolutionary processes are in a sense connected to each other, and that there is a memory that kind of guides these processes. If it worked well in some case, like a certain, I don't know, evolution of a particular amino acid could have gone many ways, but it went one, it's more likely to go that way again another time. And so what I remember from assembly theory is that there's like an assembly space, and within that assembly space, um, all possible there's infinite possibilities, but those infinite possibilities are constrained by the past and also by the environment that constrain the space of possibilities, which sounds a lot like the theory of time that I see. I think one thing that I would be very interesting to see is physicists and take seriously the idea of the virtual, not just this is I guess what I take from Heidegger, which kind of helped with my thinking with my dissertation. The idea, his criticism of the metaphysics of presence, that the only thing that exists is what is present, that the past and the future are nothing or ontologically negative. I think the idea of thinking about the future and the past as ontologically positive forms of absences is a very powerful one. And I see, for example, assembly theory take that seriously. And so even though it's might not be a correct theory, the fact that there are people trying to incorporate these ideas of the future as potential, the past as preserved, and those things existing in a different form than the present, but still interacting with each other, is going in the right direction. There's a You might know him. I'm trying to remember. Last name is Eppert, Michael Eppert, maybe.
Oh, Epperson.
Epperson. Yeah, I've talked to him a little bit,
Hmm.
briefly email exchange, but I really admired his work, the little that I know of it, where he tries to use Whitehead science to interpret quantum mechanics and the idea of
Yeah.
potentia, incorporated into quantum mechanics, taking seriously this idea of the ontological positive absence of the future. And I think quantum mechanics lends itself well to incorporating these different ideas about time, because with the wave function also, um, there's a sort of, prior to it, the actualization of the particle, if you will. There's this sort of virtual projection. It's probabilistic. It will probably be here, but we can't actually predict it. And these probabilities depend on both on the particle's initial conditions and its interactions with its environment as well. And so I on the little that I have been following, it seems like there might be some push towards this direction. Um,
Right.
but that's as much I think as I can say about it. Because the way you put it, I think there's a lot of inertia. I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
inertia there.
I'm glad you're in touch with Michael Epperson. I mean, it seems to me that probability and statistics have been part of science since thermodynamics in the 19th century, but it's always been understood um, epistemologically, like it's a limitations
Yeah,
of our knowledge. And the the frontier now, I think, in physical ontology and metaphysics is how do we understand nature itself as probabilistic, right?
yeah,
It's not just a limitation of our knowledge, it's that nature is a creative advance and there are like the future is open. We don't live in a block universe, but that open future does have a certain uh, um, texture that's not yet determined. There's like a field of possibilities which are more or less likely to occur in the future, but what ends up happening is very much a matter of, the creative decisions made in the present. And so trying to shift from an epistemological understanding of probability to an ontological understanding of it, I think is where Bergson and Whitehead were so ahead of the curve and hopefully will be taken up more by scientists as they try to think through that problem. But the issue of memory in neuroscience and cognitive science, a lot of researchers are still looking for some way that memories could be stored as material traces in the brain or whatever. And to me, that seems like um, missing the point entirely.
yeah.
And there's I'm going to read a couple of lines from Creative Evolution that I love. He says, duration is not merely one instant replacing another. Duration is the continuous progress of the past, which gnaws into the future and which swells as it advances. In reality, the past is preserved by itself automatically. In its entirety, probably, it follows us at every instant. All that we have felt, thought, and willed from our earliest infancy is there, leaning over the present, which is about to join it, pressing against the portals of consciousness that would fain leave it outside. Um, so it's like, how do we understand the past as still present with us, but not identical with the present? So we have to
Yeah.
imagine the past as it's a real potentiality to use Whitehead's terms, whereas what's happening in the present is a process of actualization, and that distinction, allows us to avoid we're not determinism. We're not determined by the past because it's a real potentiality for the
Mhm.
for the for the actual occasion occurring in the present to make use of, but not to be, and to be conditioned by, but not to be determined by. And that, like, one of the issues I think here in the challenges of ontologizing probability or thinking about it ontologically and not just epistemologically is maintaining that distinction between actuality and virtuality or potentiality. Um, so much of, I mean, materialism is basically a form of what you could call actualism, where
Yeah.
there's nothing there's no way of thinking about the reality of what's held in reserve, or what's not yet actualized. And um, by understanding process and time, real time, so deeply, I think Whitehead and Bergson both give us uh, concepts for thinking and maybe methods for intuiting what that potentiality is, right? That allows us to both inherit the past without being determined by it and to imagine futures that we might move into.
Yeah. And I always wondered, like, how did Bergson come to the conclusion that the past is preserved? Like, is there any precedent for that? Because it's
Mm.
genius when you put it into, for example, solving the mind-body problem. It seems, at least conceptually, to work, but how they came to that insight is something that I'd be really interested in exploring. But I do think that that is the key. I think that once people start taking seriously this ontological category of potentiality, or as Deleuze calls it, the virtual, that that is, I think, the breakthrough that will, I think, get rid of some of the inertia. And I've tried to write a little bit about this. I did a conference presentation where I wrote about incorporating the ontological category of the virtual into understanding energy. But um, I I start to feel like I get out of my depth in terms of physics there. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of what stagnated it a little bit, and also the commitments to trying to incorporate, again, ethics, or thinking more about ethics. But I really, my intuition really is that that is the key to moving beyond actualism, as you put it. The
Yeah.
question is, show people, how do you show people the value of this sort of thinking? And also, it's not something I can't show you the past, I can't show you the future. So it's interesting to think about how do you go presenting this to people that are resistant to this idea.
Right.
And I
So,
think the problem of consciousness, I've been also reading some panpsychist literature, Philip Goff. I'm not sure I really buy into that kind of panpsychism, but I think presenting maybe the persistence of the past as a means of solving the mind-body problem might be one of the more convincing ways of convincing people of that memory isn't something just stored materially in your brain.
right. Yeah. Um, so you've spoken a little bit about your more recent interest in ethics, but like what's next for you? What are your research interests and what direction do you see yourself going in?
Oh man. So a lot of this has to do with, I think, where my philosophizing is starting from now is I guess a particular experience of, I guess you could call it, revelation, that I was reading Plotinus at the time that it happened, and it seemed to just Plotinus seemed to explain it as a communion with the one that just seems spot on in terms of how he describes it. Then I got into the literature of mysticism, and it just resonated really powerfully, more powerfully, I think, than anything I've ever engaged with. And so trying to reconcile this, I guess, intuition of the transcendence of the good, or as Plotinus would put it, a communion with the one, that I really do think drives, I guess, drives our nature, this turning of the soul towards the good. I have come to accept as maybe for me the most important question in philosophy, and what has kept me away from it, I think, is my scientific materialism that I guess reduces also the mind to I guess a reductive form of physicalism. But I guess my work now is trying to show. I have a bunch of paper ideas I have here on my computer, but Simone Weil, for example, the way she writes about so openly about her mystical experiences, but also the tension between science and necessity, and also grace and ethics and the good. I think that's the direction, at least for now, that my work is moving in. I still haven't decided. I'm still in kind of the research phase of things, but I'm trying to put all these intuitions together, that from Bergson, Simone Weil, Iris Murdoch. I'm also, at least personally, very engaged with Zen Buddhism, especially the Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition of Zen Buddhism. And I've also gotten into Kitaro Nishida, um, so I'm moving towards that sort of thinking, try to reconcile the sort of transcendent nature of the good, and and these, I guess, mystic intuitions of um, how, I guess, the end of William James, I think, put it really well in his Varieties of Religious Experience, that the Hindu formula of Atman is Brahman. Um, that is essentially what I'm trying to explore, and also make reconcile with all this metaphysical speculation that we've been talking about, because I really do think these two things coexist with each other. And for me, the holy grail of philosophy is that attempt to harmonize in an intellectually honest manner what we know about physics and the natural world with a coherent metaphysical scheme that accounts, especially for me, the reality of time and consciousness, and also accounts for the transcendental nature of the consciousness and its relationship to the goodness or the one. I don't know if that's all very abstract, but
No,
that's
it's not abstract at all. I love that.
that's where it's all going. And I think what's held me back is that Thich Nhat Hanh has a when he's been talking about the dangers of metaphysical speculation, he brings up an adage, basically, if someone is wounded by a poison arrow, are you going to wait to figure out, what that arrow is made of, who shot it, what that poison is made of, before you actually start the healing process, right? And that's what he says, the danger of metaphysical speculation. You don't need to have all the metaphysics and science figured out in order to engage in, I guess, ethical inquiry in this approach to whether it be nirvana or this. I think all ethics, good ethics, eventually comes down to thinking about how do you begin to dissolve the ego, the attachments of the ego or the self, in order to open yourself up to um, a greater reality beyond yourself. And so that's essentially where it's all going, trying to make sense of all these things.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean that Buddhist sense of like do you want to keep suffering or you know do you want your are these metaphysical questions going to help alleviate suffering in the world, your own and other people's? Um I think that's if there's not a in religious studies there's this term soteriological. If there's not a salvific or saving element to the thoughts, to the metaphysics, um, then why are you doing it? On the other hand, if you're more Nietzschean, it could be or nihilist, then it could be that the truth, there's this philosopher, um, Ray Brassier. He wrote a book called Nihil Unbound, where he argues that like the truth um, is is not conducive to life. And so if you're in
Yeah.
pursuit of truth, you're inevitably going to be depressed, and you're going to realize that meaning is just something that, human beings suck on like a pacifier, and ultimately, science will burn through all of that to reveal just the cold facts and logic of this machine that we happen to be in. And I think that's such a tempting direction for especially STEM type people to go in. Um,
Yeah.
but I think it's wrong. I don't think truth makes any sense independent of goodness and beauty.
Yeah.
Um, like truth itself is of value, right? And so you can't if you're going to be full blown nihilist, then you have to let go of truth as well. You can't have
This is
that.
what I tell my students. So I had this discussion with my students the other day, and especially my nihilistic students, it was a great conversation. But that's what I pointed out. This is what Nietzsche points out. You're not a nihilist. You're committed to truth. So you still have a value. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, that's great though. I'm glad to see you going in that direction. I mean, was it Plotinus that sort of initiated or sparked that kind of mystical experience, or did you have that first and then turn to Plotinus to understand it, or like what was the order of operations there?
My interest, so it's funny because I started as a hardcore Nietzschean, and now I'm kind of at the opposite end of
Uh-huh.
the road. But I think it started, the seed was planted by Hans Jonas after I read The Phenomenon of Life.
Mm,
Um, I did Nietzsche, went to Heidegger, kind of hit a roadblock with Heidegger, where the ultimate message, at least to my understanding, was let things be as they are. I was like, okay, great. What do I do with that? And Jonas really started to make me take seriously the idea that you have to have a combine ontology with ethics, some idea of goodness or intentionality in nature with materialism. And that planted the seeds, and that's when I started investigating it. And I think I don't know, probably it didn't just so happen that these things coincided, but the experience that I had originated from it wasn't just mine. So that's why I don't want to share personal details, because I shared it. It was a shared experience that was a difficult shared experience. But at the time, I was reading Plotinus, and it seemed like the best explanation of what was happening. And so it was
mm,
like that. Maybe in a sense I was looking for it, but um, that's why I identify so much with, I guess, someone like Vey, who says, I wasn't going looking for this, it found me. And now everything that I do is an attempt to explicate this. And so it started, I think maybe Jonas planted the seeds of this idea of combining ontology and ethics. And then a friend of mine, a mentor, recommended that I read Pierre Hadot's book on Plotinus.
Mm.
Um, and then those two things just coincided and it completely changed the trajectory of my thought.
Nice.
Yeah.
Um, I think we only have a few more minutes here, but I think you should consider trying to come to the International Whitehead Conference, which would be next summer, summer 2026.
That'd be awesome.
Um, have you ever heard of it? It's every 2 years.
I haven't. Where is it?
In 2026, it's going to be in Illinois, Southern Illinois University in
Okay.
Carbondale. So not too far from you in Colorado. It's probably um, 2 hour
All
flight.
about. Yeah.
Um, and it's there's generally like 10 different tracks all across all of the sciences and humanities. You don't need to address Whitehead. You could talk about Bergson or Plotinus or anything vaguely process related. It's a big diverse family. But I think you'd have a lot of fun there. And yeah, I was in Germany in 2023 in Munich, and it moves around every 2 years to a different continent. Um, but I think you'd have a lot of fun there and meet some colleagues that can support you. I don't know how well you feel supported. You're teaching at two different schools right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
And
the hardest part is that this sort of thinking doesn't seem like there are departments that are continental or analytic or
right.
have a specific focus, and process thinkers are very dispersed. And so that's why I reached out to you because I'm looking to form some sort of intellectual community that I felt like I haven't really found one where I fit in so far.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you reached out. Um, I'd love to do another conversation. Maybe we can read some Bergson or some Plotinus. Choose a paper or chapter or something and talk about it together because I think yeah, your experience with these ideas resonates deeply with mine, and it'd be yeah fun to keep exploring together.
Yeah, I'd love to. Bergson has lectures on Plotinus that were translated by someone in California, a professor in California,
Hmm.
Center for Integral Studies, I think. Um,
Oh, Jack Bagby, John Bagby.
yeah. He translated
He's
Bergson's lectures on Plotinus. That'd be
he's a
something
colleague of mine. Yeah, yeah. So
interesting
maybe
to read.
maybe he could join us.
I'm down to read anything. And also, if you have any recommendations for Whitehead, because Whitehead seems to have similar concerns of harmonizing, theology and metaphysics and physics, I find that also incredibly valuable.
The best. I'm always struggling to figure out what the best way for people to be introduced to Whitehead is, but more and more I'm realizing his book Religion in the Making,
Huh.
which is 1927 or 28. Um, it's very short and it's about the evolution of religion, but there's a chapter in there, chapter 3, where he gives a condensed statement of his metaphysics, um, which is very clear and much easier to understand than the full-blown systematic treatment in process and reality. Um, so that might be a good place for you to go to begin getting your head around Whitehead. I mean, I've been studying him for over 15 years and I still learn something new every time I reread Process and Reality. But yeah, that's great that you know Jack's work or his translations of Bergson on Plotinus. Why don't we plan to read that together and I'll reach out to Jack and see if he wants to join us to discuss his translations.
Yeah, that would be really fun. That would be awesome.
Cool. Awesome. Well, I'll reach out about that. Um, really appreciated meeting you, Pedro, and um, yeah, keep up the good work.
Yeah, thank you. You too. Thank you for doing what you're doing in terms of getting process philosophy out there and digging into so many different facets of process philosophy and how it's relevant. That's really admirable. So thank you too.
Can't help it.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah.